So, for this lecture, we are focusing primarily on the 1950s, but I want to start by talking about that word affluent. So, an affluent society is a society in which the people are living really well, right? And in this particular context, we are talking about a population of people who have achieved their American dream, right? They've reached economic success. They have an economic stability like FDR promised them, thanks to the GI Bill and thanks to the economic boom after the war. So things are going really well for them. But what I want you to be mindful of is that this affluent society does not exist for everyone, right? It's for a specific group of people. And so we're going to talk about what this society looks like, who is in this society, and what does it actually mean, right? I want to begin by playing a commercial for you from Ford. And I want you, as you watch it, I want you to think back to what we discussed in the 1920s. And I want you to remember, in particular, there was an ad in the 1920s of a family walking as they saw all of these streets parked or driving along the road. And then pay attention to this woman in this commercial. What is she saying? What is she wearing? How is she selling this car, and what is the purpose of it?
Fine. Yes, I'd love to. Thanks, Jean. I'll be there. 2:00. Goodbye. 3 weeks ago, I couldn't have accepted that invitation. Like so many people these days, we live in the suburbs, and Dave needs the car every day for business. When he was gone, I was practically a prisoner in my own home. I couldn't get out to see my friends, couldn't take part in PTA activities. I couldn't even shop when I wanted to. I had to wait till Thursday night after Dave brought the car home. But that's all changed now. 3 weeks ago, we bought another Ford, the new low-price custom line Victoria. Isn't it stunning? Dave has it all to himself, and I now have the ranch wagon all to myself. It's a whole new way of life. Now I'm free to go anywhere, do anything, see anybody anytime I want to. It's only good common sense. Why be stuck with one expensive car when you can enjoy all the fun and freedom of two fine Fords?
Today, more and more families are finding out how easy it is to become two Ford families. You can choose from 20 different models, colors galore, and each available with Thunderbird power, with styling inspired by the famous Ford Thunderbird, and each with the extra protection of Ford's Lifeguard design. See your Ford dealer soon.
Okay, so now we have, instead of a family walking and seeing all of these cars and being jealous like they were in the 1920s, we now have a housewife who is all dressed up, right? She's got her pearl necklace on, her pearl earrings, her hair's all done, makeup is done, and in a dress at home. And she is talking about the benefit of having a second car, right? And she talks about how she needs the car for herself, whether it's to go shopping, whether it's to visit friends, maybe the PTA meeting, whatever. But she's talking about now having the need for a second car. And I want you to think about what that means, right? It means that they have access to wealth. It means that they have access to the kind of wealth you need, right? The disposable income you need, that you can afford a second car. And notice she's not working. She's a stay-at-home mom. It's only her husband that's working. So even on the one income, they are able to afford a second vehicle, which is a part of her message here, right? And that's what I really want to talk about here, is how and where we come to this moment of the golden age, right? So I want to first start by talking about the reasons for economic growth, or how we got here. So in your notes, make sure that you write these down. So that way, if you get the question of what were the reasons for economic growth for the United States in the 1950s, you have this list readily available. It starts with military spending. So you may remember that in the early years of the Cold War, after NSC 68 is published, the federal government starts pushing millions and millions and millions of dollars into military spending, whether it's research and development, sending the military around the world, whether it's just building aircraft or ships or whatever, all of that military spending is leading to an economic boom. And a part of the reason why, if you remember from the speech that I made you listen to that Dwight Eisenhower gave at the end of his presidential address, a lot of civilians are now working in the defense industry. They're working as engineers, as technicians, and they are working to help build up the military. So military spending helps to create jobs. It helps to create these paths for research and development. So scientists are working, researchers are working, and all of these people are working together. And while it does expand the strength of the American military, because of all of that, what also happens is you see this immediate impact on regular everyday Americans in terms of automation. You'll notice I have an ad there in the middle of the page for the gas range. My new gas range dresses up the whole kitchen, she says. Well, here's the thing. Automation from World War II and the post-war era is going to lead to a lot of changes in how people live their everyday lives. So we see the development of the microwave, the television, more efficient washer and dryers. Everything is automated now. So people are living differently. Everything has changed in terms of how they get everyday tasks done. And because things are automated and they seem so much nicer and they seem so much better and more efficient, and because people are working and because people are making money, of course it's going to lead to consumer demand, right? Of course people want the second car. Of course people are going to want the better house. They're going to want to live in the better neighborhood. They're going to want the better clothes. Everything now has a demand, and fortunately for them, there is a supply to meet that demand. The other thing that happens here that a lot of people sort of dismiss or don't really think about nearly as often as they should is, of course, the baby boom that happens in the post-war era. Between 1945 and 1960, we have millions of babies being born. And at that point in American history, it is the largest generation of people born in the history of the United States. So all of these soldiers are returning home from war, and before you know it, there are all these babies, millions and millions and millions of them. And what you have to understand, if you don't already, is that babies are expensive, right? Babies need space, they need toys, they need an education, they need, checkups, they need all these things that cost money. And the baby boom contributes to economic growth because it's a part of consumer demand, it's a part of automation. And I want you to take a look at the fact that, or take into consideration the fact that families aren't just having one child, they're having multiple children, right? And multiple children means more money. They're going to need more space. And because they need more space, you have the emergence of the suburb. The suburb is a 1950s phenomenon that begins as an experiment in what is called the Levittown. Levittown was actually the early version of suburbs. It started in New York, and it was the idea that it was based on the idea that you could make homes quickly and easily as long as these homes followed the same or similar floor plan, and they had the space to do so. So the suburbs are a couple of different things all at the same time. One, they are neighborhoods, but they are also a part of areas that are just outside of the major metropolitan area, right? They're just outside of the city. So these are neighborhoods where the homes essentially look the same. There are things that might be different, but you'll have a one-car garage or a two-car garage with one tree in the front yard with a fence and maybe 2 or 3 bedrooms, 1 or 2 bathrooms, the kitchen, the living room, that they all follow that same sort of style, right? They are easy to build, quick to build, and they are affordable. I want to point out this Life magazine cover, and I especially want to point out this little headline, this little line right there. Family buys best $15,000 house. And you'll notice that it's dad and mom with their 3 kids looking out of the window of their brand new house that only cost them $15,000. Now, granted, in the 1950s, $15,000 is a lot of money, especially when only one person is working. However, what you have to keep in mind is that dad is making enough money so they can afford the $15,000 house. That's the kicker. It's that these dreams, these goals of owning the second car, owning a home, are not out of reach. They are completely achievable. They are completely within your grasp as long as you have a good job that pays well and supports you so that you could attain those things, right? And when you have all of these people who are working and earning money, and because they're earning money, they're spending well, and they're spending not just on little things but on big things, it pumps money back into the economy. So the economy is booming, and everybody who's living in these sorts of areas are doing relatively well. But here's the kicker. This is the flip side of things. When we talk about the lifestyle of the 1950s, there are two predominant things two predominant labels or descriptors that you can use to help better understand the 1950s. One is consumerism and the other is conformity. Consumerism, of course, is the idea that you should be able to buy whatever you want, and people are buying whatever they want, but they're buying primarily to fit in with everybody else, right? It's to live like your neighbors do. So when you see that your neighbor has the second car, you want the second car. When, your neighbor has a certain kind of suit that he's wearing to work, you want that suit. It's the idea that you have to keep up with everybody else. And that ties into that word conformity. When you think of conformity, think of conform. Conform means to be like everybody else, because conformity is what promoted the American lifestyle, right? Of working and making money and spending money. It's a very capitalist driven idea, right? It's not democratic, it's capitalist. And this is where we start to see that split in the idea of what American freedom means. Because for so long, we've seen this partnership of freedom and capitalism and what it could really look like for people to have economic freedom as well as democratic freedom. But here we start to see the split, because when we talk about conformity, it's about being like everybody else, thinking like them, dressing like them, believing like them. Because if you didn't, you were immediately labeled anti-American. You were immediately considered an outsider, right? And this is driven a lot by the Red Scare. This is driven a lot by that fear that communists were everywhere and that you had to be fearful of your neighbor, fearful of your teacher, fearful of your librarian, because they were slightly different. So conformity helped to prove your Americanism, for lack of a better word, and your American identity. And in the most ironic way, the American identity prides itself on individuality. So just sit with that for a second. Now, while this is happening, the United States is going through this period of a new global status. And by that, I mean you see the emergence of the superpower. The United States leads the world economically, militarily. It has the largest amount of influence, and it makes sense, right? Because after the war, Europe is being rebuilt, Japan is being rebuilt, to a certain extent, so is Russia. But all of these major areas of the world are going through this few years of transition in which they have to be rebuilt because their infrastructure has been destroyed. But the United States naturally emerges as a leader because we don't have to deal with the kind of infrastructural damage that they have. So it's a little bit different. Our circumstances and the context is different for us. Now, that said, when we talk about or when we describe this as a golden age, let's talk about and let's be honest about who this golden age is for. Because when we talk about who's moving to the suburbs, historians and sociologists describe this as white flight, where white middle class America escapes the city and moves to these suburbs because they don't want to live where they work, which is understandable. However, if you are Black or you are brown and you live in the cities and you want to work out, you want to move and you want to also separate your work life from your home life, you don't have the same opportunities as your white counterparts. The picture on the top right shows one example, and this is in Michigan, where a neighborhood is quote unquote exclusive. What they mean is it's whites only, right? What I want you to be mindful of is this sort of behavior, this sort of discrimination is happening across the country. This is not a Southern problem. This is an American problem, because Black families especially do not have access to financing in the same way. So they do not have access to the GI Bill. They do not have access to financial lending from banks in the same way. And so they don't have access to suburbs in the same way as white families. There's a story of a white woman in Oklahoma City who wanted to take her children and move to another place, another area of the city. So she sold her home to a Black family. The father was a doctor of some kind. But when the neighborhood found out, she was put into a mental institution. The white woman was put into a mental institution. Her children were sent to live with her ex-husband, who had been abusive for a very long time. And it's this long, dramatic story of efforts to keep Black people out of suburban areas. If you want to know more about that story, let me know, and I will share more material with you. But that's what's happening, right? It's creating a separation, not just along race lines, but also along economic lines, because working class people can't escape that way, and neither can racial minorities. And instead, what starts to happen is, to meet the needs of the poor, particularly the working class, government starts to invest in what's known as public housing, but popularly in popular conversation, we call them the projects. So if you're in larger cities like in Philly or New York, or anywhere, or Detroit, wherever, you'll see the emergence of public housing. And these are buildings that are apartments, basically, that are built by the government, and they are not well maintained. It is not safe to live there. You don't want your children to be there. These are not good neighborhoods. These are not good areas, but it's all done in the name of urban renewal. And urban renewal was the idea that we were going to build back our cities. We were going to make them these glorious areas where it brought back more investment, but that would mean driving out working class people. And so the only place that those people could afford to live would be in public housing. So we're further creating this division and this separation between those who have and those who don't. The other thing that starts to happen during this time is a partnership between fundamentalist Christians and the anti-communist movement. I want to talk about what fundamentalist means so that we're clear here. When we talk about fundamentalist anything in terms of any kind of religion, it means a very strict interpretation of their holy scripture and a very conservative social belief system. Okay. And so what starts to happen is in the 1940s and the 1950s, there is a movement among fundamentalist Christians. And this is across denominations, right? So it's going to be led by Baptists, but there are Baptists, there are Lutherans, there are Methodists. So anyone who believes in a very strict interpretation of the Bible will start to embrace this idea that Christianity is a part of the true American identity and that communists cannot and do not believe in God. And so anyone who identifies themselves with the communist movement is not only anti-American, they are also anti-God and anti-Jesus and anti-Christianity. Right? And so they present themselves as a part of this fundamental fight against communism. And so you start to see the emergence of these different campaigns to bring Christianity into these very public spaces. So, for example, the phrase "In God We Trust" is going to be printed on American money as a form of public declaration of the American Christian identity. Then there's the phrase "One Nation Under God," which is a result of a petition that's put together by fundamentalist Christians who believe that if communists were to say the Pledge of Allegiance, they would not be able to say this phrase, "One Nation Under God," because their belief systems would not allow them to say that phrase because they are so atheist and they are so anti-God and anti-Christianity that it would prevent them from making such a confession. What starts to happen is over the course of several years, you start to see the emergence of the new American conservative. And by this, I mean, this is going to be someone who will take their belief systems and apply it to how they vote. And this is going to take a while to show up in larger numbers, but you will know this from your primary source assignment. There will still be in the 1960s. There will still be leaders, from the 1960s and the 1970s who remain in leadership positions, particularly in the Republican Party, who do not believe that religion should carry any kind of influence over politics. However, by the 1980s, fundamentalist Christianity is going to take over the conservative mindset. It begins, however, in the 1950s. I want to point out ways in which they do that. And I want to point out this little poster here to the right. So you'll notice you have a family here with husband, wife, and the children. And of course, this phrase right here, "These are fundamental." So, of course, at the center of the image is their brand new house, but at the top, you'll see these three images in sort of a faded thing, as if those three things contributed to them buying their house. One, of course, the first one on the left is a school. The one in the middle is the image of a church. And of course, on the right, it's supposed to represent work, right? And the fact that the church is at the center is incredibly important, because when we talk about these are fundamental, what this poster is implying is that these are the fundamental values, the fundamental ideas that contribute to the American dream, right? It's during this time period that we see the emergence of the phrase Judeo-Christian values, right? It's designed to create this implication, these stories that the founding fathers were Christian and the founding fathers believed very strongly in one thing or another, all tied to the Christian narrative. That begins here in the 1950s. Now, I want to talk about the leading Republican of the time, which is, of course, the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, who has a very long history of a military career. He is a global leader at this point. But when he is elected President of the United States, he is not someone who ties himself, even though he is a very deeply dedicated Christian himself, a man of faith. He does not tie himself to fundamentalist Christianity. However, he is very deeply committed to fighting against communism. That includes sending special ops into different parts of the world to fight against what he believes are very real communist threats. So they are sent to parts of the Middle East, parts of Central America. So areas of the world where he thinks that they are vulnerable to communism, he is spending sending special forces to go and deal with them. However, he is not going to send the military just for fun. He is incredibly strategic when it comes to the military and when it comes to these long-term ideas of how to fight against communism. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. One, he pushes for the establishment of the interstate highway system. You see a map of that on your screen here, of where these highways would go, as is proposed by his bill. But the interstate highway system, including I-40, I-35, I-44, all of which run through Oklahoma, the interstate highway system is designed for the military. What Eisenhower argues is that during a time of war, if we are attacked, we need to mobilize our military, and the military will have a really hard time being able to get from one place to another if they are forced to drive on roads such as Route 66. Route 66 was much too narrow, and in some places it wasn't paved as well. And so the idea was getting an interstate highway system would make this process much easier. Now, once again, this is an example of how automation benefits the American public, because in the end, it's Americans who use the highway system to commute, to travel, to go on vacation, but its purpose was for the military. It's the same thing for the National Defense Education Act. The Soviet Union has been making huge advances at this point in terms of science and technology. They had successfully sent a satellite into space, which many Americans believed would be a spy satellite. The Russians were working on sending a man into space, and the Americans were terribly behind. So the National Defense Education Act proposed to fund the educations of young people, men and women, who were interested in STEM fields, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. For those young people, not only would their education be funded by the federal government, but also they would have careers waiting for them. Of course, this is assuming that they do everything successfully, but they would all have careers waiting for them. That's the idea. So you can imagine how Americans are benefiting from bills like this. One, they're getting the benefits of being able to travel across the country through highways. But two, if you're a young person and you are particularly gifted in the fields of STEM, then your college is paid for, and you have a good paying job, a well-paying career in front of you as well, which helps to contribute to this booming economy. But let's talk about the young people, and let's talk about how young people are responding to this conformity lifestyle. And the way that they are responding is they're not. They are rebelling against it and pushing back against it with all they have. And the ideal or the perfect movie to sort of narrate this story, of course, is at the bottom right, starring James Dean, who is the movie star of his time. He stars in a film called Rebel Without a Cause, in which he is the only son of a middle-class white family who move into a brand new city, a brand new suburb. His character is bullied by the popular kids. His family life isn't great because his father is an alcoholic and is very verbally abusive, and his mother doesn't like talking about it. She doesn't address anything. She pretends that everything's okay. And that's what boomers are really rebelling against. This idea that you have to present this image of perfection, right? You present this image to the outside world that everything is okay, that you are successful, that you are happy, that you believe what everybody else believes, that you are doing what everybody else does, and you are also living this American dream. And boomers are really frustrated and angry with that sort of behavior. And what they're doing is pushing back against that. What they want to do and what they argue for is this life of expression and honesty and genuinity. So I want to talk about the ways in which they are rebelling. One prominent way, and the most prominent way, is through rock and roll. Think of this as what's going on in the 1920s with jazz. Rock and roll is loud, it's in your face. At times it can be overtly sexual. It talks about all sorts of stuff depending on who's singing and what they're singing. The man pictured with the guitar here on the top left is Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry's considered the father of rock and roll, and he's also someone who is going to go on national television and perform in front of all white audiences, all white teenagers, I might add, at that, with his bandmates, and his bandmates are all white. He is the only black man there, and typically in class I would play the clip for you, but the idea though is here is a black man playing a very loud instrument, saying all sorts of things, and talking about poverty, talking about pushing back against norms, societal norms, and doing it in a way that white teenagers who are from the suburbs absolutely love and can't get enough of. And of course, what makes it even worse is when you have white musicians and white artists starting to do the same thing, and nothing pushes this more than Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley used to sing gospel music. He was a church boy, and now suddenly he's singing rock and roll, which was considered black music. He is openly sexual in how he dances, and he has thousands and thousands and thousands of teenage girls screaming their heads off every time they see him, right? The fact that you have this young white man from the South who, a good man with good morals and good upbringing and all of that stuff's now suddenly singing and performing in this way is seen as a huge sign of rebellion against what was widely accepted as good morals and good society. Then of course you have the beatniks. Beatniks are poets and writers and young people who are basically finding ways of expression to push back against those societal norms, right? So these are young men and young women who are doing whatever they can to push back against their parents' generation. And this idea that they have to be a certain way, act a certain way, is not something that they want to do. Another form of rebellion that a lot of people don't consider rebellion, but I'm going to just for the sake of clarity, is the civil rights movement of the 1950s. And what most people don't realize is the civil rights movement of the 1950s actually happens in two forms. So I'm going to talk about those two forms. The first is the courtroom fight, which is best personified in Brown v. Board of Education, which takes place in 1954. It's the story of a little girl in Kansas who has to walk several miles to catch the bus to go to her all-black school when a white school is only a few blocks away. And when her father files a lawsuit to get her into this all-white school, it becomes a huge Supreme Court case led by Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall is the leading lawyer of an organization we've talked about before, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples. Thurgood Marshall emerges in the 1950s as a huge civil rights leader, but he primarily focuses on the courtroom fight. He is using the law to challenge the law. That's really what the courtroom fight is about, using the law to challenge the law. And so when we talk about his strategy, Marshall uses two black psychologists to demonstrate that black children are taught from a very young age that because they are black, that they are less than, and they are not worthy of equality, that they are not beautiful, they are not smart, they are not capable. So that what Marshall is trying to do is prove to the court, demonstrate to the court that by having segregation in schools, you are actually instilling into an entire population of people that they are second class. that they are not the same or they are not as good as everyone else. Now, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at this time is a guy named Earl Warren, who is appointed to be the Chief Justice because Eisenhower thinks that he'll be a normal guy who won't cause any trouble or won't bring about any any issues. But Warren actually sees this as an opportunity to make things right, especially those things that are morally wrong. So it's clear to him that segregation in public schools is a moral wrong, and it is up to the Supreme Court to correct it. So he approaches the 8 other justices and says to them, this needs to be a unanimous ruling, that we have to unanimously decide to integrate the schools. And the reason why it needs to be unanimous is because he's dealing with 8 other justices. Mind you, all 8 justices, they are liberal and conservative, they are Democrat and Republican, and they are coming from across the country, right? And so he knows that the Supreme Court, if they're going to rule to integrate the schools, it needs to send a clear message to all Americans across the country, no matter where they're at. The clear message needs to be that segregation is an injustice. It is wrong, and we have to fix it. And there needs to be no doubt. You can't have an 8-1 ruling, and then that way somebody says, oh, but look at that one guy. That one guy said that segregation is okay. Warren doesn't want any room for debate. Here's the problem, though, with his ruling. They don't set a firm date to integrate. So in other words, he basically says his version of as soon as possible. And as soon as possible can be interpreted in any way, shape, or form, especially when you're dealing with hardcore racists who don't want to integrate their schools. So when you don't set a firm date, that means it's up for interpretation. And they don't know how to enforce this. The Supreme Court can't figure out what a good way to enforce this is, and Eisenhower isn't about to inconvenience himself on enforcing this because he's got other priorities. His priority is dealing with communism, and he is not really prioritizing segregation and integration and that sort of thing. So what happens is public schools are ordered to integrate, except they don't all integrate immediately. In fact, there are schools in Oklahoma that are not integrated until the 1970s. So that should give you an indication of how problematic things get. Now, when the ruling comes out, there are a group of congressmen who decide to put together a statement, the statement that is widely referred to as the Southern Manifesto, in which they say that the courts are out of control, that Warren doesn't understand the lifestyle, especially of the American South. He doesn't understand how Americans live. They are out of touch with American reality. And I mention this because I want you to understand the lengths at which people will go to preserve what they are most comfortable with. Right? That's the thing. These congressmen put their names on a document in which they are saying integration is actually a terrible thing. We don't want our children integrating with Black children at schools because they believe that it'll do great harm and all sorts of other ridiculous things. And this is accusing the Supreme Court of interfering on issues that, as the Southern Manifesto claims, they claim that the Supreme Court has no right to interfere with people's ways of life and a cultural way of life, which we heard back in the 1860s, I should add. Now, the other form of the fight for civil rights is at the grassroots level. When I say grassroots level, I mean regular people who are fighting for their rights as individuals and as citizens. So the grassroots level means at the ground level, at the most basic level. So these are regular people. And I can't tell the grassroots story without mentioning Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old black child from Chicago. He and his mother, it was just him and his mother. And at 14 years old, he and his mother, Mamie, were planning on a vacation for the summer, and Emmett wanted to go visit his cousins in Mississippi. Now, Emmett is 14 years old, a 14-year-old boy, has no real idea of what life is like in Mississippi in the 1950s. He has no real comprehension of what it means to be black in Mississippi, especially in the 1950s. So during the summer of 1955, against her instinct, she allows him to go visit his uncle and his cousins in Mississippi. So he's hanging out with his cousins outside of a store, and he's bragging about how he has a girlfriend, how he's hung out with white girls, and how he at one point had a white girlfriend. You know, typical 14-year-old boy stuff where they just talk a lot and they don't need evidence to support any of the things that they are saying. So as they're talking outside of this store, his cousins and a couple of friends dare him to whistle at the woman in the store, at the clerk. And this is a white woman. She goes, she's in the store working, and Till goes in because he's 14. He whistles at her and catcalls her basically, and then they run away immediately because they are 14. That night, the woman told her husband. Her husband gets his brother-in-law, and they go to Emmett's uncle's house because they find out that's where he's staying. They demand that the uncle release Emmett. He says absolutely not. They go in anyway. They sort of bombard him. They go in anyway. They find Emmett and kidnap him. Emmett is nowhere to be found, and 3 days later, his body was discovered floating in the river. The body was beaten and bloated beyond recognition. In fact, this is what his body looked like upon discovery. You could not recognize him. He looks nothing like this young man here, but that was him. And the only reason why he was identified was because he was still wearing his father's pinky ring. And so anyway, there's a lot that goes on, but finally, thanks to intervention from the Chicago mayor, his body was brought to Chicago on a train, and that's where his mother becomes a pivotal character, a pivotal individual in the civil rights movement. You see her pictured here on the right. That's her and Emmett. And then, of course, there's the tragic photo of her weeping over her son's casket. Mamie Till contacts black magazines that are published and print and distributed across the country, and says to them that she wants an open casket and she wants photographs of her son published in their magazines. She wants Black Americans to see what happened to her son. And essentially the message is this could be you or it could be your son. Whether you do something or not, this is what they are doing. This is what they're doing to us. This is what they are doing to our children. And just so you're aware, her son's two murderers, these two men here, these two men were found not guilty after the jury deliberated for just a few minutes. And then 2 months later, they were paid a few $1,000s. I want to say $4,000, but they were paid by a magazine to describe the murder. That's how we know in detail what happened to Emmett Till, how they beat him mercilessly with the butt of a gun, with all sorts of different weapons, all sorts of different objects, and then and then drowned him by tying him to a massive fan. It was a mess. But the reason why we know the details of his murder is because they confessed to it 2 months later, and because of double jeopardy, they were not brought to trial. And Emmett Till's family did not have any justice for that. Now, when we talk about why this matters, Mamie Till choosing to publish pictures of her son is what will inspire the Montgomery bus boycott. This is where we have stories of Rosa Parks and her activism, her refusing to give up her seat on a public bus. Now, just so you understand, Rosa Parks was a civil rights activist long before this moment, long before this. She had been working with her local civil rights organization, with the local NAACP. But what makes this significant is two very important things. One, it teaches people the power of their own protests, right? People knew Rosa Parks, and when people found out that Rosa Parks had been arrested because she simply did not give up her seat, thousands and thousands and thousands of African Americans decided that they were not going to ride the bus. They were not going to ride the public system, transportation system in Montgomery, Alabama, which almost ended the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama. The protest lasted for over a year. They were consistent. They were vigilant. They kept at it. And because they kept at it, the public transportation system in Montgomery had no choice. Either they integrated their buses and public transportation, or they lose business altogether, because their prominent customers were Black. And so the first lesson they learned was that people can make a difference. The second significant moment from the boycott is the emergence of a brand new civil rights leader. And that's a guy named Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was only 27 years old when the boycott began. He just started his new job as the pastor of the local church. And because he had been so eloquent, because he had studied the tactics of Gandhi from India and other nonviolent protest leaders and civil rights activists, he emerged very quickly and very clearly as the new leader of the civil rights movement. And so when we get into the 1960s, we'll talk about what his leadership looked like and what the leadership looked like in the context of a new decade.